Hello, and thank you for joining us today for a discussion of COVID-19 and food insecurity, co-sponsored by Duke Sanford School of Public Policy, the Duke Center for International Development, and the Duke Sanford World Food Policy Center. This is the fourth in a series of interviews we are conducting with leading experts on the intersection of COVID-19 and development. I am Sarah Bermeo, and I'm Associate Professor of Public Policy and Political Science in the Sanford School at Duke University, and the Associate Director of the Duke Center for International Development. For MPP students joining us this fall, I will be teaching the Core Policy Analysis course. I study international political economy with a focus on relations between industrialized and developing countries, particularly in foreign aid, migration, and trade. My co-host today is Kelly Brownell, founder and director of the Duke Sanford World Food Policy Center, and Robert L. Flowers Professor of Public Policy, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke. Kelly is an expert on nutrition, obesity, and food policy, and has published 15 books and more than 350 articles and chapters, served as president of several professional organizations, and has received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association. At Sanford, he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in food policy. We are pleased to welcome Johan Swinnen, Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute. Prior to his current position, Dr. Swinnen served as a professor of economics, as a lead economist at the World Bank, and as an economic advisor to the European Commission, among other posts. He is a fellow of the Agriculture and Applied Economics Association and the European Association of Agriculture Economists, and served as president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists. Dr. Swinnen has published extensively on agricultural and food policies, international development, political economy, institutional reforms, trade, and global value chains. You can find a link to his most recent book, The Political Economy of Agricultural and Food Policies, in our Twitter feed. The International Food Policy Research Institute provides research-based policy solutions to sustainably reduce poverty and end hunger and malnutrition in developing countries. IFPRI's regional and country programs play a critical role in responding to demand for food policy research and in delivering holistic support for country-led development. Johan, thank you for being here and a virtual welcome to Duke.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here. As I just told you, I had never made it to the Duke campus, and I regret not being live there today, but I hope this will be a good substitute and a good incentive for me to come live at a later moment.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And I've long admired the work of IFPRI, and I can only imagine how extreme the demands must be on your schedule right now with all the things going on around the world with respect to food. So thank you again for joining us. So as my first question, before we begin discussing the impact of COVID-19 in particular, I think it might be useful to better understand the situation of global food security and nutrition leading up to the pandemic. So with climate change, with things like climate change and population increases, political strife, degradation of the land and the sea, and other factors, the ability of the world to feed itself faces real challenges, even leading up to COVID-19. So I'm hoping you might give us some insight on what you see as the leading overall challenges related to food insecurity, and what you believe the top priorities might be for addressing them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, there's a lot to say there. I think let me focus on three important big developments over the past years. The first one is actually very positive development. Okay, so if you compare the period, let's say from 1995 or 2000 up till 2017, 2018. We see that there's been really big improvements, significant improvements in the food security situation in the world. And these are very much paralleled with improvements in poverty reduction, etc. What is much less good news is that this seemed to have stalled and even reversed a couple of years ago. And so there are probably two main reasons for that. One is that climate change has really started to not longer become a theoretical thing or something of the future we discuss, but something to have real impacts on poverty and also on food security. The other one is that, and these are to some extent unrelated and to some extent related, is that we see a number of political conflicts which have emerged. And these political conflicts obviously always lead to, basically people being displaced, people don't have access to proper food, etc. And so, of course, people have argued that these are not independent of climate change, but that climate change has been reinforcing the likelihood of having conflicts. And so people are now saying the combination of COVID with more conflicts and climate change effect is really setting us back and really reversing this trend of major progress in food and nutrition improvements and in poverty reductions of the last 20, 25 years. Then the third element, which is again a global long-run trend, is that we see a continued increase of obesity in the world, of nutrition problems related to obesity. And this is a very general trend. And we see that while these things were initially mostly in rich countries, obviously, when you go back, they are now really very important in middle-income countries and even in parts of the poor countries as well. And you see changes over there that in poorer countries is typically the groups, the social group, which are a bit more well off in terms of incomes, where basically obesity is on the rise, and particularly in the middle income countries. I mean, there you have what they call the double or the triple burden of malnutrition, which is taking place now. And this was all before COVID was taking place.
So what structural problems in the food system do you think COVID-19 has exposed? And do you believe there are approaches that could go beyond sort of incremental change to make fundamental improvements in food systems?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm sorry. I think there's a number of structural weaknesses or problems that have been. It's not that we didn't know about them, but COVID-19 has really reinforced how important that these are and identified them in a very dramatic way, actually, and unfortunately, mostly a negative dramatic way. The first one is about resilience. Okay. Now, what you see how COVID has affected our food systems around the world is that there are actually large variations in resilience that we already kind of knew, but now COVID has really made that very clear. Actually, some of our food systems have held up remarkably well. Okay, think about grain production in North America or in Russia, whatever. Okay, so a vast and part of Latin America. I mean, these are vast areas of the world where basic grains are being produced, and they are very little affected. Okay, so you have big combined harvesters which are basically going through the land, and so social distancing is not a problem. Labor use is not much of a problem. Everything's very, in some cases, basically these tractors are driven by satellites, so you don't even need people anymore. On the other hand, what we see is that a significant part of our food systems and our supply chains have been very vulnerable to, and so they were vulnerable before for a number of reasons, to climate and whatever. And so COVID had made that. I think the most important thing we have learned from COVID is the large heterogeneity in our food systems, and also the heterogeneity in how resilient or not resilient they have been. Now, this is very different from, for example, when we were in the late 2000s, we had this food price spikes on the global world markets, I'm sure you know about. And so there we had a lot of food security problems. Why? Because prices went up. But we did not have disruptions of the food systems as much as we do now. So I think the best analogy to what we experience today is more what happened in the Soviet Union, in Russia and Eastern Europe in the 1990s. Because also there, we had a complete disruption of the food systems, okay, of the supply chains. The crucial difference between then and now is that at that particular time, the crunch was in the capital markets. So it was really, I mean, interest rates went through the roof, there was no access to credit, etc. And so that meant that all the systems which were very dependent on capital inputs, which is typically the higher technology systems, etc., they were much more affected than, for example, in China, where most of the work was done by labor at those days. I mean, China was then very poor still, and there was relatively little machines being used, etc. Okay, and so now you see the opposite. You see that those systems, those supply chains, which are highly mechanized, relying on knowledge, on robotization, on capital, are much less affected than those which are heavily dependent on labor. And so this is, if you look at it at, let's say, the big classifications, typically food systems in poor countries are much more labor intensive than they are in rich countries. Okay, so it means that poor countries are in that way much more affected. But as I'm sure you know, some of our rich country or developed country food systems are also affected strongly. And why is that? Because in specific nodes of our food system value chain, a lot of labor is used, and often people come together. Think about the US meat packaging industry, okay, where in basically the meat processing centers, there's a big problem. Why? Because people have to come together in the same surrounding, and that is a problem. And so you have other, like, for example, in California, I think the some of the vegetable harvesting systems use a lot of migrants, same thing in parts of Europe. And so these things are also affected, again, because labor is restricted. So that is certainly a big issue. We'll come back to that, what that implies for the future as well. The second one is inequality. So we know that the food system is unequal in the sense that it's basically poor people are much less inclusive, or the food system is much less inclusive with poor people than it was towards rich people, okay? And COVID has really made that much stronger and brought that out. So why are COVID disproportionately affected? First of all, because we see that their incomes, when incomes decline, poor people spend a large share of their incomes on food. And so that means there already you basically have a direct income which is stronger. Now, what do poor people have in terms of assets, in terms of their capacities to go and earn an income? Essentially, it's their physical labor. That's what poor people have. Rich people have capital, they may have investments, they may have machinery, they may have a factory, they may have restaurants, whatever. Or they can sit like us, we can sit behind our computer and work even without leaving the house. Poor people cannot do that. They just have their physical labor. And that means, so they're hurt both on the consumption side because their income's going down and they spend so much of their income on food, and on the production side, on the income, the capacity to earn an income. Then there are a number of other factors. One is the private sector, the value chains, what I just described, are typically more disrupted in poor countries, but also the public sector systems are more disrupted because poor people depend on school feeding programs, on community, or whatever, social programs, protection programs, which are organized through community centers where they can't go anymore. And then in particular, also, if you look within the subgroup of the poor, in this case, it's the urban poor, the consumers who seem to be affected more than the farmers. I can come back to that later if you want. And then particularly women and then migrants or former migrants, because they can't move anymore, they are also disproportionately affected. Okay. In terms of, there's a couple of other points, but which we can come back later. Maybe let me just make the other point, another thing is on the nutrition issue, okay? So you already know that we have made a lot of progress in terms of reducing food security from the perspective of not enough calories. We have made much less progress in terms of nutritious food and the quality of the diets. And what you see now is that problem is made worse for two reasons. One is that with the income declines, what do people do when they earn less income? So they shift from a more expensive diet to a less expensive, cheaper diet. Meaning typically you shift from you shift towards basic calories, which are typically cheaper, coming from where you use, and we see that both in our model predictions, we see a shift from fruit and vegetables to basically grains, and also reduction in dairy consumption and meat consumption, etc. And so our first results, which are basically phone survey-based results from Ethiopia and other countries, support that very much. Okay, you clearly see that the middle or the richest part of society hold up relatively well, but it's in the poorest parts where this thing is falling back. And then the one element which also plays with that is that if you get, for example, disruptions in let's say in grains, okay, in grains value chain, you can store grains for a while, which means that if it takes a bit of time to get reorganized, maybe to have the truck come in the village or whatever, it's fine. With fruit and vegetables, many of these are fresh, okay, and that means they're much more vulnerable again to these transport disruptions, etc. So you read the stories about basically people in a village, they have to throw their tomatoes away or their lettuce or whatever it is, and then 50 miles further, people don't have access to the same vegetables, really.
So thank you. Boy, there are a dozen really interesting follow-up questions I'd like to ask, but let me ask one in particular. So there are many actors involved in the global food system that range all the way from small farmers to very large corporations and, of course, policymakers. And both with regard to the response to COVID-19, but also more generally, what would you suggest for better coordination? And are there governance priorities you might suggest?
Yeah, I think we are now at the stage that we can see different, almost different moments, if you want, of policy interventions which will be needed. And so the first thing what people have done, or where governments had to think about, is crisis management. Okay, you see things falling apart, and so okay, how can we best deal with that? I think a second phase is the recovery phase. Okay, so how can we basically make investments or set up policies which stimulate the recovery? And then a third phase, which is beyond that, but where I think we should be starting to think about, okay, so how can we think about, if we're going to have to make changes anyhow, how can we use these to come up with something which is not what we had before, which is actually better than before, okay? And so there's now this phrase which is used a lot, which presumably you've heard, is building back better. I mean, when we reconstruct the system, let's not reconstruct the system, but construct a better system, a more resilient system, okay? And so for each of these three phases, you kind of have different policies, I think. I think what's definitely needed is at the same time a stimulus to get the economy going again in a variety of ways to do that. And that link to, of course, we will have to take into account the social distancing issues, okay, and the food and the safety, the health and safety measures. And so in the shorter run, basically systems to make sure that the food gets from the producer to the consumer, okay? And so developing systems of what's being called in some cases green lanes, that foods get special priority treatment in transporting systems. Because most of the information that is available suggests that the production of food has not been a problem up to this moment. Okay, that may change next season or something, but at this, so the problem was getting the produce from the fields, from the farmers to the plates of the consumers. The second one is clearly social safety programs, social safety nets, programs to support the incomes of the poor, either through cash transfer programs or a variety of different instruments. And in that, we have a couple of people in the Institute working on these issues, on specific, and it's said, like, when you set up this program, it's really important to take gender and nutrition into account. So don't just give any food to the poorest, but make sure that the food they get is actually nutritious food as well. Okay, just don't give them only rice or wheat or something. Okay, that's important. And then we see that there are fairly important gender effects of COVID, how how COVID affects and the lockdowns affect women differently than men. And so then also in the programs that you set up, you have to be careful that these are not reinforcing this gender bias, but you're actually basically compensating for it. Okay, there's a nice blog on our website by Shalini Roy and her colleagues who go through kind of items to look at or characteristics of programs to look at. Okay. And then another point which was very important early on in the discussion was that what you see is that governments do similar things as normal people do in a way, right? Which is like what happened in the beginning. People went to the supermarkets and tried to buy as much as possible. Okay, start hoarding. Okay, remember the toilet paper you could no longer get in the supermarkets, right? And so what governments do is a bit similar, right? So they're scared that their population is going to run out of food, and particularly I think it's a combination of genuine being concerned and also the political concerns that if the people run out of food, people come on the streets and there may be political unrest, etc. for political. So these things are always related. And so what they have done, a lot of the food exporting countries have started in export bans, restricting export. And of course, that may help in your own country. It just makes things worse on the global market. Typically what you have this dynamic effect that feeds on each other because one country does it, another country does it. And then basically, and this effect was very strong in the late 2000s with the food price crisis. I think this time, many organizations like the World Bank, FAO, we have very early on started warning about this thing. And so there's been more coordination this time, I think, there was last time. But also, I think countries were just generally better prepared. The food stocks were much bigger this time than last time, which also means that you're more resilient as a government as well if your food stocks are well filled than if they are not well filled.
So the world's been grappling, of course, with COVID-19, and at the same time now, there are protests beginning in the United States and then occurring elsewhere in the world with attention to the issue of racial justice. And you mentioned this already, but IFPRI has addressed the issue of inequality with respect to issues like gender, smallholder farmers, people in rural areas, and people in climate and conflict-related zones. But how does race fit into this picture? And are there policies or programs that you believe might be especially beneficial in this context?
So the current developments, have brought race very much to the top of the policy agenda, to the discussion. And so it's really interesting to see how this has spread out all over the world right now, which basically reinforces the fact that racism and basically discrimination based on race is not limited to a particular place or a particular time. It seems to be almost it is global in that way. And so now an important fact which comes back is that the problems of racial discrimination have very structural problems, And so I think also one of the things we try to do at IFPRI is really target, first of all, try to understand how some of these problems are coming from, what the root causes are, what is really the problem, and then of course, how can you target policies to improve the problem. And so in that way, I think it's crucial that if we understand the structural problems or the structural roots of these things, and particularly with related to food security, because that's what our expertise is, and hunger and poverty, that we can basically also in that way address some of the racial problems which follow from that, I think. And so you see there's many countries in the world where we operate on where there's a lot of social injustice. Some of it's related to, well, gender is obviously a major issue, but race is an important issue, sometimes also caste or other types of minorities.
Good. Well, thank you so much. And let me pass the baton back to Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Dr. Swinnen, for a wonderful conversation so far. I want to transition a little, and in doing so, point out to our audience that IFPRI's website has an excellent section on that focuses specifically on COVID-19 and food insecurity that is co-edited by our guest. So I know that we are at some point posting a link to that in our Twitter feed, and I would encourage people, we'll also be posting links to individual, and we have been posting links to individual studies from there, but I would encourage people really interested in this topic to check it out. And the questions that I'm going to pose now come from looking through some of those, and really, just fascinating stuff. So one thing I wanted to, also to remind all of you to send in questions so that they can be queued. So when we turn to questions and answers, we can just launch right in with the wonderful questions that always come in from the audience. So many of the posts that are on the IFPRI site deal with anticipated outcomes in individual countries, including some fairly detailed analyses. So my question to you, Dr. Swinnen, is can you give us a sense of which countries or regions are likely to face the greatest increases in food insecurity due to COVID-19, and why you think these particular places might be disproportionately affected, and what an effective policy response by governments or the international community might look like?
The countries we work on are typically the poorest countries in the world, right? Which is they're typically they are concentrated in Africa, South Asia, and some of our countries also focus on Latin America. And so we have been working there for many years, many decades even in some of the countries. And so we've built strong relationship with local research, with local institutes, etc. And so what we've been doing is we have been working at two levels in terms of, so on the one hand, we've been doing scenario building, trying to estimate what the problems will be, what the impacts will be. And at the same time, we are in the field now together with our local collaborators trying to basically assess what the actual impact is, okay? And as you can imagine, we cannot actually go out and interview, so typically we try to do it through other means such as phone surveys. I'll come back to this phone surveys later because that has specific issues with it, the data collection issues. In terms of our global models, okay, so we have both global models and kind of the country level models, estimate that depending on the extent of government intervention, okay, but if there would not be really significant government interventions in the countries like social safety nets, income, basically support, etc., up to 150 million people could fall back into extreme poverty, and that's a lot of people, right? And so about 80 million of that order of magnitude would be in Africa, 40 million would be in South Asia, and then the rest would be Latin America and some other parts of the world. And so we have done, in addition to that, we've done in a number of countries impact, and you see that our some of our estimates in terms of increases in poverty vary between 15% and 35%, for example. And this is over the lockdown period mostly, which we saw. And I mean, that's really big, you know. I mean, 50% is very light, but 35% is huge. I mean, it's enormous to have an impact of that size on this country. And so we're working right now also on the basically on estimating the kind of the rebound effects. What happens if basically the economy is opened up again? How soon will they recover? For example, our estimates for Ethiopia show that if even in our relatively pessimistic scenario, probably the growth in Ethiopia in the second part of the year would make up for the fall in the first part of the year. But compared to where there would be if there wouldn't have been COVID, I mean, it's probably 10% lower or something. So it's a huge, basically, fallback compared to the trajectory without COVID. There was something else I wanted to say, but it'll come back. Right, and then if you see what's interesting in our assessment, okay, is that if you look, this comes back to the heterogeneity of the impact, which is really important, I think. So for example, if you look at different sectors, you see that the service sector is really hit much stronger than the other one. And that is also, I mean, you know, it's the same thing in the US or in Europe, right? I mean, restaurants closed down, all these, the service businesses closed down. Industry is less affected than services, but actually agriculture is doing relatively well. For example, our data for some African countries show that there has been a significant, let's say 50% decline of GDP in agriculture, but that's considerably less than in services or industry. And one of the reasons is that most developing country farms are family farms, okay? As they are actually in many European countries or so. And that means the use of family labor has been less restricted than the use of hired labor. And that of course means that the impact on the production. Now this is at this particular time, so there's a lot of concern right now that the fertilizer and the seeds and whatever the animal feeds may not come to the farms because of the breakdown, and that farmers may not be able to plant their seeds for the coming season. And that of course will be a big problem for basically for their situation at the end of the next harvest, etc. And so, I mean, that is, and of course, if farmers were unable, let's use the example of the tomatoes again. So if farmers were not able to sell their tomatoes this year, well, they'll think 2 or 3 times before they're going to grow tomatoes again for the next season, okay? So there's a reinforcing effect in the dynamic perspective on this, okay?
Yeah, I know that the way that this ripples through so many different industries is something that I know, you know, you and other experts are really focusing on. I want to pivot slightly and talk about a less direct effect, but still, I think an effect that could have an impact on people's food security, and that is what we've been seeing on research on the what's expected to be the decline in remittances, so that families are receiving from overseas, and I imagine many families rely on this type of income to support their you know, ability to get sufficient amounts of food. And I wonder if you're seeing anything on that, this impact of declines in remittances from family members overseas, and how that might be affecting people's food security.
Yes, I mean, it's actually a very important factor. And so our first, we've done now country studies on a few countries. One is on Myanmar in Asia. The other one is on Egypt. So in both cases, we have good data in terms of the impact of international remittances mostly, and also tourism, for example, in a country like Egypt is really important, obviously. And so, well, in one case, it's kind of interesting. It's almost like the mirror image, right? Tourism means that foreign people cannot come to your country to spend the money there. And in remittances means that your own people cannot go to work in another country and then send the money back. And in both cases, these trade or these migration restrictions, if you want, if you see tourism like migration, are really having a big impact. Okay, so our impacts, the estimates we do for Egypt show that it could be up to 10 to 15% of their GDP decline. Similar things in Myanmar. We know that in very poor countries like Nepal, for example, a lot of people working abroad, sending money home. In Central Asia and countries like Tajikistan, etc. Yes, it's really important. So that's the international migration, okay? And typically, these are the poor people who send out one of the sons in the household maybe to go out work, or the man goes out working, sends money home, etc. Well, often it's the man, of course. It could also be the female members of the households. And then, so there is a very interesting study by Scott Rozelle and his team. Scott is a friend of mine. He's a professor at Stanford University. So he's been working his whole life on China. And so based on the connections he had within China, okay, he's been able to estimate what the impact has been by the internal lockdowns in China on basically incomes from rural households. And so he estimates that even the first month and a half or so was the impact on the fact that so many of these people who were working in the cities, okay, urban areas, they went home for the Chinese New Year when the lockdown came, and so they were not able to go back. And he estimates something like $100 billion loss in household wages in rural areas, which of course it's huge. And even now he says it. I mean, according to his estimates, only half of the households have been able to send their people back to the city, so they continue to accumulate. And then he has some new data where he's, okay, so how does that affect? Well, it affects people spend less on nutritious food. They spend less on education. Okay, so typical things which we know are really important for child development. And so the dynamic long run effect of that are probably much more important than the short run effect.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask one more question, and then I will pass it back to Kelly for for the first follow-up or chat question. Reminder to send in questions to our chat. Kelly and I can see them as you send them in. Okay, so one of the pieces that I found as a researcher, very interesting on your website, was a piece. There are actually kind of two in this vein that talk about the role of think tanks in the policy process in developing countries, and how that is being affected by COVID-19. And what that means for kind of knowledge capacity in these countries. So, it would be great if you could give the audience kind of a little background of the role that think tanks are playing just in general, pre-COVID-19. I'm thinking about policy on food security and nutrition in developing countries, and then how that might be being threatened by the COVID crisis that we find ourselves in now.
Yeah, this yes, I mean these think tanks can play an important role, or let's say, or a broader term of research institutes, or however you want to define them. Okay, and so they play a role in various aspects of the policy process, if you want. So they're involved in, or they try to influence the policy agenda. They try to come up with good ideas for policy reforms or for new policies to be introduced. Of course, they are important in monitoring the implementation as well, of what the impacts is of things, and well, monitoring and evaluation, if you want, of the policy interventions or policy proposals. So they play a role in various aspects of the whole policy process. I think they are under pressure right now for two reasons. Okay, one is that, and we see that also in the whole donor community, with all the donors have to rethink basically their priorities in funding allocations. And so this typically, the one thing is obviously health issues have become much more important. So both, of course, in your own country, in terms of for the government to invest in basically the whole health infrastructure, also in basically support incomes of the poor people, the social safety in the countries. And then, of course, the same thing if you want to give aid to other countries in terms of these things. And that means that at the same time, there's basically major economic recessions everywhere, which means that the tax revenue for the governments is going down and will certainly go down more next year, probably. And all of these things means there's a crunch on funding potentially for these think tanks, okay? Because they're typically supported, they can be supported by private donors or public donors, but in any case, there's going to be basically pressure everywhere. Another way why some of the think tanks may be pressured is because they may come out with findings which are, how should I say, uncomfortable truths for some of the political regimes, and so the regimes may not like the findings of these think tanks. Okay, and if COVID is reinforcing that, that may provide another reason why there may be pressure on these institutes to be careful about the statements that they make, or basically see their funding cut because people don't, I mean, the governments or whoever's in charge of controlling them doesn't like the message they bring. Okay. Maybe just one point when we talk about research, which may be important as well. So we as well, okay, and these think tanks as well, and the institutes we collaborate with in the fields, is that it's just hard to get information out now. Okay. So there's a lot of stories about how things are terrible there, how things are not so bad there, but all of it is ad hoc. There's very little representative information where, well, we are scientists, but that's the job, right? Get the right data, analyze them in the careful way. That's what we're going to do. And so one of the things at IFPRI, we have spent decades on building up our survey systems to go in the field, do randomized control experiments, of all these things which are not possible now. And so what we have done as well with other countries, other institutes, is move to phone surveys. But phone surveys have a problem that you almost have built-in inequalities when you use them, because who has a phone and who doesn't have a phone, right? Rich people have phones, and well, increasingly poor people have phones as well, but of course there's still a bias in these things. And so we have to be very careful how we use the information which comes out of these phone surveys to feed into policies which are targeted to people you can't use or who may not be in your data set fully captured.
Yeah, no, we've definitely at Duke had many of our studies halted at some point, including some of my own work in Central America, because it's just not safe to do in-person surveys. So I can imagine grappling with that on a worldwide scale is quite daunting. We're getting some questions in from the audience now, so I want to pass it back to Kelly to pose the first one of those, and then we're going to do an alternation. Kelly will ask a question and then I will, so we'll kind of go back and forth and keep the questions coming.
So one very good question from a person in our audience was this: are there any examples of a country that reformed their agricultural subsidies to improve their food systems for both sustainability and health outcomes?
Well, yes, there are a number of cases where the reform of policies have really contributed to much better food security outcomes, I think. Well, the biggest example, or the most spectacular example, is probably China. I mean, China had a dismal policy system in the 1970s. 1960s, 1970s, with, I mean, huge famines, a lot of people who died of food security, and by both reforming their land property rights system, where they basically gave the land back from these inefficient communist-style large farms to household farms, and at the same time, very gradually opening up the economy by giving farmers incentives, better incentives to prove. I mean, they have contributed to a huge growth of income in China, poverty reduction, food security, and the agricultural reforms have played a tremendous role on that. And so other countries like Vietnam, etc., have done similar types of thing. If you look at the rich countries, I think Europe is an interesting example because Europe had an agricultural policy system which was hugely distortive in the 1970s, 1890s even. And so where they basically fixed the prices for their farmer way above the market prices, and then they had surpluses and they dumped the surpluses on the world market and basically hurting a lot of developing countries. So Europe has very much restructured its, reformed its agricultural policies in the late 1990s and the 2000s. And the result of this is that Europe still gives a lot of, a massive amount of subsidies to its farmers, but in a way which is much less distortive to the rest of the world. And so in a way you can say that the reform of the European policies have had significant impacts on food security in the rest of the world. And I also think in Africa that there's been significant changes in the past 20 years in terms of some of the policies there. They're less spectacular, but in some cases clearly, and which have contributed to much better food security outcomes right now.
Great. Well, I have a question that has come in that specifically addresses this idea of building back better, and the individual would like to know what building back better looks like for thinking about the balance between local and global production. And I know that IFPRI has done a lot of studies, both COVID related and not COVID related, on things like global value chains and supply chains in the world market. So I wonder, are there things as we build back better that we can think about in terms of production systems?
That's a very good question. On the one hand, it's easy to answer. On the other hand, it's really not easy to answer. And so you hear often statements saying like, okay, COVID is just the ultimate proof that global value chains don't work. They are basically, we got to move back from them. We have to go back much more to local supply chains and etc. because for a number of reasons, sustainability, resilience, and whatever, right? I think that conclusion is not justified, I think, okay? The reason is that if you look at which supply chains have held up well and which not, I don't think there is a clear local or domestic versus global, okay? Some of the global supply chains have held up very well, I think. Some of the locals have basically not held up very well. I mean, there's major disruptions in some of these local supply chains. And so I think it's much more complex, the analysis or the conclusions actually of the analysis than saying global versus domestic, right? That is not to say that some of the global ones have failed as well and some of the locals have done well. So I'm just saying that the conclusion there, you have to be very careful in drawing the conclusion. I think what is true, though, is that what is important is to diversify in your sources and in your value chains, okay? And so that if you are dependent on, let me go back 1 second and I'll come back. Think about climate change as well. Say you basically say, okay, we're not going to import food anymore. We're going to basically grow everything domestically, okay, with shorter supply chain. So what happens if you have a big drought or a big flood or whatever, right? That means that your supply chain is very, basically very vulnerable to, for example, these shocks in the weather systems, okay? So I think it's much more smart to have a combination of sources, of places where you source your food from. In that way, diversify your security, if you want, of the food that you want, and also of your supply systems, etc. And I think that's what happened. I mean, when you talk to, for example, I've talked to a couple of large-scale multinational food companies recently in meetings. I was in panels. And so that's what they do thinking as well. They say, well, you know, this has really, we had been thinking about sustainability issues for a number of reasons, but COVID is now pushing this message hard, okay? We have to be, we cannot depend on one particular system of production, of transport, of basically shipping, etc. We have to make sure we have a diversity on different systems that we use so that if one system is hit for whatever reason, we can fall back on the other systems, okay? And in that way, I think countries should think the same way and governments, okay? Be resilient in the way that you have a variety of different systems which are buffering you to if one of these elements is being hit, rather than saying we got to go local or we should stay global. I think that's probably the wrong message, I think.
Thanks. Then the next question has to do as well with building back even stronger. And here's the question. This person asked, what's your understanding of whether COVID did or didn't originate from wet markets? And what do you think we should do to build back better, since these markets are an important economic, agriculture, and cultural asset?
Yeah, I cannot give you a better vision on whether it was caused by the wet market or not than anything you can read on the websites or online, or people who are really specialists in that, like epidemiologists. In terms of the future, I think clearly we should invest in much better food safety systems broadly, okay? And so to make sure that almost all the people who are specialists in this field say, this is going to come back, okay? And why? Because it has come back. I mean, we've had cases in the past where essentially Europe was not affected from, and basically the US much less, but I mean, parts of Asia were really heavily infected already by some of these things. So almost certainly this is coming back. So you have to set up systems which anticipate that this is going to be something which may happen regularly. And so that means investments in adjusting these markets, how they operate. But a lot of it we know, because food safety issues is not something which comes suddenly falling out of the sky. We work on that for 30 years or something. The other thing is that when the co-editor of our blog series at IFPRI is John McDermott, and John knows the epidemiological side much better than I do, because that's how he was trained. He's worked in some of these institutes as well. And he and some colleagues of him have written a blog actually on, they say, listen, so far for the past 15, 20 years, all the pandemics have come out of Asia, okay? But we should be ready to expect that some of them coming out of Africa in the future. And he identifies some specific reasons for that. And again, I'm just summarizing what he says. It's like, it has to do with basically the population density. And so the argument there is that population density in Africa compared to China or some has been much lower compared to that. And that means that the pressure and the intensity of the interaction with some of the animal systems has been less. And so it's less likely that you have transmission of some of these viruses. That's going to change, okay? And it may very well be that the next pandemic is not coming out of Asia, but will come out of Africa. And so again, if we know that, or if we think that may happen, we got to start thinking about how to set up systems to prevent that.
Thank you very much. So as I've mentioned before, our audience on these events is fairly diverse and includes a lot of students. So I want to get to a question that I think must have come from a student or maybe a professor. So for graduate students who want to enter this field, what areas of research kind of need the most attention, and where can graduate students contribute?
Oh, they can contribute in numerous ways, right? Studying hard to begin with. I think it's really important to have a very good education, train yourself very well, and then basically step into the profession. I was trained as what was then called an agricultural economist. Now, I'm not sure if agricultural economists still exist in programs, because they've been typically called now applied economists or something, but still, I mean, I would call it a life science economist if you want. But of course, you can make so much important contribution from different fields, people who studied environment, people who studied public policy, psychology. I think from a whole bunch of different areas, we need expertise. And certainly in the future, we need ways of these different people getting together and basically coming up with I mean, I think the pandemic now is a really interesting illustration how I think it's really, economists can play a really important role to understand, okay, how are incentives affecting this thing, what's the impact, etc. But it's clear you need to understand, okay, much more the technical side of it, the health issues, etc., both from the human health part, but also the animal health parts and viruses. And so we need to come together and work together to learn from each other and learn together, okay, and bring all this knowledge together. And I mean, I know Kelly is a psychologist. I mean, this is hugely important. Okay, how do people react? Why do they choose certain types of food and not other types of food? How important are, for example, environmental conditions, climate change issues, maybe now food safety issues in affecting their choice and things like that? all these things are very important to bring together.
So another question has to do with GMOs. And as we all know, there are widely differing opinions about the safety and benefits of GMOs around the world. You can just take how Europe and the US deal with those issues in such different ways. But what do you think is the proper role for GMOs in addressing food insecurity as we go forward?
I graduated, after my master's, I graduated in 1985. And then my first project I was working on was on GMOs, okay? And so I'm still intrigued by the topic, so I've gone back and forward on working on GMOs or thinking about them. At the same time, I think it's one of the areas where I thought has been most promised, and the same thing, it has been most disappointing in terms of what it has brought, all right? And so the problem on the GMO side is not so much the technology, I think, it's really willingness to accept the technology by different groups in society. And so I am, at this point, I think that certain groups in society have, I see it almost more like an ideological choice. So that some people say like we're against GMOs for a number of reasons, okay? It doesn't only have to do with technology or the contribution technology. It's more like this is something like how, for example, industry is overtaking agriculture. These kind of concepts all come together with it, I think. Anyhow, and so it's very hard to change people's mind based on information. Now, I'm almost more worried about what's happening with CRISPR technology, which kind of the new generation of biotechnology or GMOs, if you want. Because in Europe now, there has been a decision to regulate CRISPR technologies in the same way as GMOs. So they've been legally classified, which makes it very difficult, okay? And so you have important spillover effects. I'm not so much worried about European agriculture, European food security. I'm much more concerned about how these regulations are affecting regulations in developing countries. And I think there, certainly GMOs and some of the CRISPR technology can make a huge impact, okay? If you think about, so I think one of the problems is also, GMO is really an umbrella of a whole set of different techniques, okay? And some of these techniques like basically glyphosate-resistant crops, maize, etc., lead to more or at least as much use of pesticides. Others, okay, really reduce the amount of herbicides or pesticides that you're going to use. And they're all under this GMO umbrella, right? So even for environmental reasons and food security reasons, I think they could do a great job if you regulate them properly, I think. But the problem is on the regulatory issues, and it's such a controversial issue when you talk to people about it. But I think from let's say the economic studies and how they could contribute to a number of good things, I mean, the evidence is pretty obvious there. I don't think that's an issue.
Thank you. So I think maybe we have time for one or two more questions. So I want to, you mentioned, thinking about where, where one of your responses earlier alluded to the next pandemic or where it might emerge from. And so I want to think a little bit forward, right? COVID-19 is very unlikely to be the last regional or global pandemic that we will see. And so, as some of the research that IFPRI has done has pointed out, malnutrition and epidemics are intertwined. So what can we be doing kind of now and also in the post-COVID time to better prepare our systems how can we strengthen the food systems to better prepare for the next pandemic? Like, how are these things intertwined, and how can we, boost, what have we learned that we can do differently for next time?
Yeah. You keep the most difficult questions for last. I would say find a vaccine early on. I mean, that would certainly help. Well, I think, there are a number of things that we have learned, and a number of things which were hard to learn. I actually was in a panel last week, and so there I got the question: if there's going to be a second wave of COVID, okay, will we be better prepared or worse, or is it going to be worse, or will it be better than now? Okay, so it's a bit related. It's not exactly the same question, of course. And I think in a number of cases on the second wave, it's going to be worse. So it's going to be worse because if it's going to be another recession on top of what we already have, I mean, this is from an economic perspective, and that means income poverty effect, it's going to be worse. But I think there will also be things where it will be better, right? So we will have learned now in countries which were not prepared that it is important to be prepared. I think from the policy perspective, this is no longer something where somebody gave even Bill Gates gave a TED talk 5 years ago, everybody said, but nobody really paid that much attention to it except the epidemiologists themselves. I think people will pay attention now to these things. And so that, I think from a political system, from a government's perspective, is important. I also think our food systems will be better prepared because, I mean, one of the things I haven't mentioned yet, but when you talk to, we actually have a blog coming out this week, I think, from professor from the London School of Tropical Hygiene, it's about how local governments are trying to implement their social security program and also the food distribution systems, etc., given the COVID restriction and the lockdown constriction. And so she points out all kinds of innovative ways how these people try to do that. Local creativity, some work, some don't work. And I think what we have to do is look around, try to get as much information as possible and see what works well, what doesn't work well, and set up systems to scale up the ones that work well for the future. On the private sector, that's exactly what's going on. There is a lot of creativity, entrepreneurship going on right now in value chains. And we're talking about some of the biggest food companies in the world. And at the same time, some of the small SME in whatever, the cities in India or the African fields, rural areas. And so there again, we have to learn, first get good information about what they're all trying to do, which ones work, which ones don't work. And based on that, I think we will have more resilient systems next time because of the lessons that we will draw from this and thing. And so I think one of the examples is IT technology. I mean, I think e-commerce is going to get a huge boost from that. And also the use of IT, mobile phones, but other things will be, I mean, it's getting, when you talk to some of the private sector people, they said, listen, we were thinking about this thing about introducing some of these innovations for the next 15 years. We're doing them right now, okay? Because we have to. So we're shifting forward, or backward, depending on how we define it, a whole bunch of things that we thought we need to do at some point, and we just have to do it right now. And so this is going to have a huge impact on how we do business in the next 5 to 10 years. Okay. Yes, so I think that's the more optimistic sign of what may come out of this.
No, well, it's good to end on somewhat of an optimistic note. We're certainly seeing that in education as well. We're having to leapfrog technology solutions that we had thought, we're further down the road. So we are out of time. I want to thank you, Dr. Swinnen. Dr. Swinnen is the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute. Thank you so much for this important discussion today regarding the impact of COVID-19 on global food security. I'd also like to thank my co-host, Kelly Brownell, and the communications experts at Duke Sanford, the Duke Center for International Development, the Duke Sanford World Food Policy Center, and the team at IFPRI for making this possible. As we wrap up our series for the spring, I want to particularly thank Tiffany Gotzinger, the DCID Communications Director, and Mary Lindsley from the Sanford Communications team, who have done the behind-the-scenes work on the entire series to make this possible. And thanks to all of you for attending online and submitting questions to enrich our conversation. Please follow our Twitter account for a link to the video when available and for announcements regarding our next event in the fall. Until then, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.